Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we descend into the oldest written stories humanity ever carved into clay. Stories that speak of gods who waged war in heaven, gods who enslaved other gods, and gods who created humanity not out of love, but out of desperate necessity. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in these explorations of forgotten history. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something profound about knowing we're all gathered here, across continents and time zones, to contemplate the same ancient mysteries. Now, dim the lights if you can, maybe light a candle. Let the modern world fade away for the next couple of hours as we travel back more than 4,000 years to the moment when human fingers first pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, recording not shopping lists or tax records, but the terrifying truth about the gods who ruled their world. These weren't benevolent creators sitting on clouds dispensing wisdom. These were beings of immense power locked in conflicts that shook the foundations of reality itself. The Sumerians didn't write fiction. They recorded what they believed to be actual history, the memory of a time when the cosmos was young and the hierarchies of heaven were still being violently established. The tablets we're exploring tonight come from the cradle of civilization itself, ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern Iraq. This is where cities first rose from the dust. This is where writing was born, and this is where humanity first attempted to make sense of these divine forces that shaped their existence. The Sumerians developed cuneiform script around 3200 BCE, making it one of the earliest forms of writing in human history, but they weren't using it to record mundane administrative details alone. From the very beginning, they were documenting their cosmology, their theology, their understanding of how the universe came to be and who held power within it. These clay tablets survived millennia buried beneath the sands of Iraq. Archaeologists uncovered them in places like Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, ancient cities whose names echo through time like distant thunder. When scholars finally deciphered the wedge-shaped symbols pressed into these fragments of baked earth, they discovered something extraordinary. The Sumerians described a cosmos teeming with divine beings, but these gods were not the distant, abstract deities of later monotheistic traditions. They were personalities, complete with ambitions, jealousies, alliances, and bitter rivalries. They formed factions, they went to war, and humanity was caught in the crossfire. What emerges from these tablets is a narrative of cosmic conflict, a war between different divine realms and different philosophies of power. On one side, you have the gods of the sky, the celestial deities who ruled from the heights of heaven with authority and command. On the other side, you have the gods of the earth and the waters below, beings who dwelt closer to humanity and who understood the subtle arts of wisdom, magic, and manipulation. These weren't simple good versus evil dichotomies. The Sumerian worldview was far more sophisticated than that. Instead, their myths present us with complex political dramas playing out on a cosmic scale, with creation itself hanging in the balance. The war between the sky gods and earth gods wasn't a single battle. It was an ongoing tension, a fundamental conflict woven into the very fabric of existence. It began with the primordial parents and continued through multiple generations of deities, each conflict reshaping the cosmic order. The tablets tell us of a time when the elder gods plotted to murder their own children because they made too much noise. They speak of lesser gods who rebelled against endless forced labor, triggering the creation of humanity as replacement workers. They describe a primordial mother goddess who birthed an army of monsters to wage war against her own offspring, and of a young god who slew her and carved the universe from her corpse. These aren't quaint bedtime stories. These are sophisticated theological narratives that grapple with fundamental questions about power, authority, justice, and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. The Sumerians understood something profound about hierarchy and rebellion, about the costs of maintaining order and the price of challenging it. Their gods reflected the political realities of their city-states, where power was constantly contested, where alliances shifted, and where the strong dominated the weak unless the weak found clever ways to resist. When we read these tablets today, we're not just encountering ancient mythology, we're engaging with humanity's first attempts to construct a systematic understanding of cosmic governance. The story begins, as all creation stories must, with nothing, or rather, with the undifferentiated chaos that existed before anything had names, before the cosmos had structure, before the gods themselves had been born. The Sumerians called this primordial state the time when heaven and earth were not yet separated, when fresh water and salt water mingled together in an endless, formless expanse. Two beings emerged from or embodied this primal chaos: Apsu, the personification of the deep fresh waters that lay beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the embodiment of the vast salt sea. These weren't gods in the sense we typically understand the term. They were more fundamental than that, elemental forces given consciousness, the raw materials of existence itself animated with will and awareness. Apsu represented the sweet waters, the underground aquifers and springs that gave life to the land. His domain was the Abzu, that mysterious realm of fresh water beneath the surface of the earth, the source of all rivers and wells. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu wasn't just a place, it was a cosmic principle, the primordial deep from which all creation would eventually flow. Tiamat, meanwhile, embodied the salt waters of the ocean, the vast chaotic sea that surrounded and threatened the ordered world of civilization. Where Apsu was the life-giving depths, Tiamat was the untamed expanse, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The tablets describe how these two primordial beings mingled their waters together. This wasn't a romantic union in any conventional sense. It was the fundamental act of creation, the mixing of opposing elements that generated something new. From the union of Apsu and Tiamat, the first generation of gods was born. The texts give us their names, Lamu and Lahamu, twin deities who emerge from the commingling of fresh and salt water. These two in turn gave birth to Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons of sky and earth respectively. The divine family tree was beginning to branch, generation following generation, each new birth adding complexity to what had been simple chaos. From Anshar and Kishar came Anu, whose name meant simply sky or heaven. Anu would become one of the most important deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, the personification of the heavens themselves and the father of countless other gods. The tablets tell us that from Anu came Nudimud, better known as Ea in Akkadian or Enki in Sumerian, the god of wisdom, magic, and the fresh waters. With each generation, the divine family grew larger, more complex, more difficult to manage, and this is where the trouble began. The younger gods were active, energetic, and above all, noisy. They danced and celebrated their existence. They moved through creation with exuberance and without restraint. The tablets describe them churning up the primordial waters with their activities, disturbing the peace that Apsu and Tiamat had known before their children were born. At first, this was merely annoying. Tiamat tried to tolerate the commotion, tried to accept that this was simply what happened when you gave birth to gods. But Apsu found the noise intolerable. Day and night the younger gods disturbed his rest. Their clamour reverberated through the depths of the Abzu, making it impossible for him to find the stillness and silence he craved. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that preserved and elaborated on older Sumerian traditions, gives us the dialogue between Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu complains bitterly about the younger gods. Their ways are truly loathsome to me, he says. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. I will destroy them and put an end to their ways so that silence may reign and we may sleep. Here we see the first hint of the cosmic conflict to come. The patriarch of the divine family, disturbed by the very children he helped create, contemplates genocide. He would rather murder his own offspring than continue to endure their noise. But Tiamat resisted this plan, at least initially. Despite the annoyance, despite the disruption to the primordial peace, she couldn't bring herself to destroy what she had made. The tablets describe her as reluctant, conflicted. What? Should we destroy that which we have made? She asked Apsu. Their behaviour may be troublesome, but we must bear it patiently. This moment is crucial. Tiamat, the primordial mother, showed mercy when the primordial father showed only intolerance. This would set the pattern for much of what followed. The conflicts in Sumerian theology often centered on the question of whether the established order should ruthlessly enforce its will or whether it should show flexibility and compassion. Apsu, however, would not be swayed. He called upon Mummu, his vizier and counselor, a personification of the mist or perhaps of technical skill and craftsmanship. Mummu urged Apsu to follow through on his plan. Destroy them, Mummu advised. Then you can rest during the day and sleep during the night. Together, Apsu and Mummu plotted the destruction of the younger gods. They made their plan in secret, but secrets have a way of being discovered, especially when the gods of wisdom are involved. Somehow, Ea, that most clever of all the younger gods, learned of the conspiracy against his generation. Ea, who would later be known as Enki to the Sumerians, was the god of wisdom, magic, and underground waters. He inherited his grandfather Apsu's domain over the fresh waters, but he added to it a cunning intelligence that Apsu himself seemed to lack. Ea understood that direct confrontation with the primordial patriarch would be futile. Apsu was ancient power itself, the embodiment of the deep waters from which all the younger gods had ultimately descended. You couldn't simply challenge such a being with force alone. Instead, Ea relied on what would become his signature approach throughout Mesopotamian mythology. He used magic, cunning, and indirect methods to achieve what others attempted through strength. The tablets describe how Ea crafted a spell, an incantation of tremendous power. He recited it over the primordial waters, weaving his words into the substance of reality itself. The spell's purpose was simple but devastating. It would put Apsu into an enchanted sleep from which he could not wake. Ea's magic worked perfectly. The ancient being who represented the deepest waters of creation succumbed to the spell and fell into slumber. While Apsu slept, helpless and unaware, Ea acted. He took Apsu's crown, his emblem of authority and power. He stripped it from the sleeping god's head and placed it upon his own. Then, while the primordial father lay defenseless, Ea killed him. The texts are matter of fact about this act of divine patricide. Ea simply slew Apsu and established his dwelling place upon the dead god's remains. The Absu, that realm of fresh waters beneath the earth, became Ea's domain. Where Apsu had once ruled as primordial chaos, Ea now established order and turned the deep waters into his seat of power. Mummu, Apsu's loyal counselor, tried to intervene but was captured and bound by Ea. The younger generation of gods had won their first victory, but it came at a terrible price. They had murdered their grandfather, the being from whom they had all descended. They had overthrown the ancient order and established themselves as the new powers in the cosmos. For the moment, it seemed as though this rebellion had succeeded completely. Ea took Apsu's place, claiming the Absu as his own territory. He settled there with his wife Damkina, and together they established a new household in the conquered realm of the deep waters. The tablets tell us that in this dwelling place, upon the body of slain Apsu, Ea and Damkina gave birth to a son. This child would be named Marduk, and he would eventually become the supreme god of Babylon, the hero who would defeat the last great threat to divine order. But that part of the story comes later. For now, the younger gods celebrated their victory. They had eliminated the threat that Apsu posed. They had established their own authority over the cosmos. They believed they had won the war before it truly began. They were wrong. Tiamat had held back when Apsu first proposed destroying the younger gods. She had counseled patience and tolerance, but now her consort was dead, murdered by their own grandson while he slept under an enchanted spell. The tablets don't immediately describe Tiamat's reaction. There's a gap in the narrative, a period during which she seemed to accept what had happened, to let the younger gods believe they had gotten away with their patricide. But the elder gods, Tiamat's other children from earlier generations, came to her with complaints and accusations. They spoke to her of the noise and chaos that continued to plague them. They reminded her that when Apsu sought to end this disturbance, she had opposed him. They pointed out that when Apsu was murdered, she did nothing to avenge him, and they begged her to take action now, to make war upon the younger gods who had killed her consort and showed no respect for their elders. These accusations stung Tiamat into action. The texts describe her transformation from reluctant mother to vengeful warrior goddess. She would not simply destroy the younger gods quickly and quietly as Apsu had planned. Instead, she would make war upon them properly, giving them a chance to fight back, letting them see their doom approaching. She gathered her power and prepared for battle, and what a preparation it was. The tablets describe how Tiamat gave birth to 11 monsters, creatures specifically designed for warfare against the gods. These weren't ordinary divine beings, they were weapons given flesh, abominations crafted for a single purpose. The list of Tiamat's creatures has survived in the texts, and it's terrifying. She created the viper snake with a venomous bite. She made the Mushusu dragon, a hybrid beast with the features of multiple animals. She birthed the Lahamu, wild and hairy demon creatures. She brought forth the Ugalu demon, the savage lion, and the mad dog. She created the scorpion man, the storm demon, the fish man, the bull man, and the Kusariku bison. These 11 monsters were unlike anything the gods had seen before. They carried venom instead of blood in their veins. They wore terror like a cloak. The tablets say that whoever looked upon them would be struck down with fear, that their bodies were enormous and their assault unstoppable. To lead this army of nightmares, Tiamat chose Kingu from among her children. She elevated him, making him her new consort to replace the murdered Apsu, and she gave to Kingu the ultimate symbol of divine authority, the Tablet of Destinies. This object was more than just a record or a symbol. In Mesopotamian theology, the Tablet of Destinies represented the power to decree the fates of gods and mortals alike. Whoever possessed it had the right to make unchallengeable commands. By giving this to Kingu, Tiamat declared him the supreme commander of her forces, second only to herself in authority. With her army assembled and her champion empowered, Tiamat prepared to make war on the younger gods. Word of her preparations reached Ea, the same god who had orchestrated the murder of Apsu. This time, his cleverness and magic would not be enough. You cannot put Tiamat to sleep with a spell when she comes at you with an army of monsters. This would require a different kind of solution. Ea went to his grandfather Anshar, one of the elder statesmen among the gods, and explained the dire situation. Tiamat had created an army. She had 11 monsters, unlike anything seen before. She had elevated Kingu and given him the Tablet of Destinies. She was coming to avenge Apsu, and she would not stop until every one of the younger gods was destroyed. Anshar felt the weight of this news. He understood that this was no longer a matter of clever solutions or diplomatic maneuvering. This was war, and it would determine the future of the cosmos itself. He called a council of the gods to determine who among them might stand against Tiamat. This is where we see the hierarchy of divine authority tested. Who had the right to speak for the gods? Who possessed the strength to face the primordial mother and her army of nightmares? The tablets describe the council's deliberations in detail, and what emerges is a picture of divine politics at its most desperate. The first candidate was obvious, Anu himself, the god of the sky and the supreme deity of the heavens. If anyone could face Tiamat with authority, surely it was Anu. He was her grandson, descended from her union with Apsu, but he was also the personification of the sky itself, the ruler of the upper realm. Anshar sent Anu to confront Tiamat, not to fight her necessarily, but to try diplomacy first. Perhaps the supreme god of heaven could convince the primordial mother to stand down, to accept what had happened, and make peace with the younger gods. The tablets tell us that Anu went forth to meet Tiamat, but when he actually beheld her and saw the full extent of her wrath and the terrible nature of her army, his courage failed him. The supreme god of heaven, the father of gods and ruler of the sky, could not stand before the fury of the primordial ocean. He turned back. He returned to the council of gods and reported that he could not face her. This was a devastating blow to divine morale. If Anu himself, the highest god in the pantheon, could not stand against Tiamat, who could? The texts describe the despair that settled over the assembled deities. They had no champion. They had no strategy. They faced an enemy who seemed utterly unstoppable, and they had nothing with which to oppose her. This moment in the narrative is crucial for understanding Sumerian theology. The old order, represented by Anu and the elder gods, had failed. They possessed authority and legitimacy, but they lacked the strength and will to defend that authority when it was challenged. The conflict between Tiamat and the younger gods represented more than just a family dispute. It symbolized the tension between ancient primordial forces and the newer, more organized structures of divine civilization. The older gods wanted peace and quiet. The younger gods brought noise and change, and now that the old order was striking back, the new order found itself without a defender. Into this crisis stepped a young god who had not yet played a major role in the cosmic drama. Marduk, the son of Ea and Damkina, born in the Abzu on the corpse of the murdered Apsu, offered himself as champion. But Marduk was not naive. He understood that if he took on this responsibility, if he faced Tiamat and her monsters and somehow emerged victorious, then he would deserve something in return. Power, real power, the kind that couldn't be taken away. Before he agreed to fight, Marduk made his demands clear to the assembled gods. "If I am to be your champion," he said, "then you must make me your king. I will defeat Tiamat, but in exchange my word must become as the word of Anu himself. When I decree a fate, let it be unchangeable. When I speak, let my command be supreme. Give me the power to create and to destroy, and I will save you from the primordial chaos." The gods were desperate enough to agree. They granted Marduk everything he demanded. They gave him supreme authority. They declared that his word would be law, that his decrees would shape reality itself. And having received this promise, Marduk prepared himself for battle. He armed himself with weapons both physical and magical. He carried a bow and arrows, he held a mace and a net. He harnessed the winds, the 4 winds and the 7 winds, making them his servants. He created the storm as his weapon and mounted it like a chariot. The tablets describe his preparations in loving detail, each element of his arsenal carefully noted. This wasn't just a fight. This was the ultimate confrontation between order and chaos, between the new cosmic structure and the primordial forces that preceded it. Marduk rode out to meet Tiamat, and when he beheld her, he challenged her directly. "You have risen against the gods who gave you birth," he proclaimed. "You have made war against your own children. You have elevated Kingu unjustly and given him the Tablet of Destinies. You have created monsters to wage war on what should be your own family. Stand and fight me, and let us settle this matter between us alone." Tiamat accepted the challenge, and the battle began. The texts describe a confrontation of cosmic proportions. Marduk sent the winds against Tiamat, and when she opened her mouth to swallow him, he drove the winds inside her, filling her belly and body with the raging storm. She tried to close her mouth, but could not. The winds bloated her, kept her jaws forced apart, made her vulnerable. Marduk shot an arrow into her open mouth, and it travelled down her throat and pierced her heart. Tiamat, the primordial mother of all gods, the embodiment of the salt sea and the chaos that preceded creation, died. Her army of monsters tried to flee, but Marduk captured them. He bound them and took them as trophies. He confronted Kingu and stripped from him the Tablet of Destinies. Reclaiming that symbol of ultimate authority for himself and the younger gods, the war was won, the primordial threat was ended. But Marduk was not finished. He stood over the corpse of Tiamat and studied it, considering what should be done with the body of a goddess who had been the sea itself. And then he did something that would reshape the entire cosmos. He split Tiamat's body in half, like one splitting open a fish to clean it. From one half of her body he created the heavens, arching them over the world like a great vault. He stationed guards to ensure that her waters would not escape and flood the earth. From the other half he created the earth itself, establishing the foundations upon which the world would rest. The tablets describe how Marduk organized the cosmos in the aftermath of his victory. He created the days and months and years. He set the stars in their courses and gave them their names and functions. He established the moon to mark the passage of time. He created clouds and caused them to release rain. He made the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow from Tiamat's eyes, which wept even in death. Every element of the ordered world, according to this narrative, was fashioned from the corpse of chaos itself. Tiamat's body became the structure of reality, her defeat the foundation of cosmic order. But the work was not complete. the gods still faced a problem that had sparked all this conflict in the first place. Who would do the labor necessary to maintain creation? Who would dig the canals and tend the fields and build the temples? The tablets introduce us here to another divine conflict, one that had been simmering beneath the surface of the cosmic drama. The Anunnaki, the great gods who had fought on Marduk's side, had lesser deities called the Igigi who performed labor on their behalf. These were sky gods, younger and weaker than the Anunnaki, and they had been assigned the back-breaking work of maintaining the infrastructure of the divine realm. For a long time, the Igigi had toiled without complaint, but the work was endless and exhausting. They dug canals through the hardest ground. They carried heavy loads of earth and stone. They maintained the waterways and built the structures the greater gods required, and they received no rest, no respite, no relief from their labors. The text known as the Atrahasis, one of the oldest versions of this story, describes how the Igigi finally reached their breaking point. They had labored for generations, some sources say for 40 years, others claim even longer. Their toil was great, their distress was immense, and one day they simply refused to continue. The Igigi rebellion was not a battle like Marduk's war against Tiamat, it was a strike, a collective refusal to work. The lesser gods threw down their tools, they burned them in a fire. They marched on the dwelling of Enlil, the god who had assigned them this labor, and they surrounded his house in protest. This was an unprecedented crisis in divine politics. How should the great gods respond to a rebellion among their servants? Should they destroy the rebels and find new workers? Should they negotiate and try to reach a compromise? Should they simply force the Igigi back to work through violence and intimidation? Enlil, the god of air and storms, the king of the gods before Marduk's rise, was furious at this insubordination. He wanted to punish the rebels harshly, to make an example of them. But other gods, particularly Ea the Wise, counselled a different approach. Destroying the Igigi would solve nothing. The work still needed to be done, and the great gods themselves would not stoop to performing manual labour. A new solution was required, and Ea proposed one that would change the relationship between gods and mortals forever. He suggested creating a new being, one that could take over the labour the Igigi refused to perform. This being would be made to serve the gods, to do their work, to free the divine realm from the burden of manual toil. The tablets describe the creation of humanity in terms that are both wondrous and disturbing. The gods agreed to Ea's plan, but they needed materials from which to fashion these new servants. They decided that divine substance would be required, that the new beings must contain something of the gods themselves if they were to be intelligent enough to perform complex tasks. They chose a god to sacrifice for this purpose. In some versions of the story, it's Kingu, Tiamat's champion, who is slain and his blood used. In others, it's We'ila or Geshtue, the leader of the Igigi rebellion, who dies so that humanity can be born. The god chosen for sacrifice was killed, and his blood was mixed with clay from the earth. From this mixture, Ea and the mother goddess Ninhursag fashioned the first humans. They created 7 males and 7 females, breathing into them the life force derived from divine blood. These humans were designed to be workers, servants who would perform the tasks the Igigi had abandoned. They would dig the canals and tend the fields and build the temples. They would feed the gods through offerings and sacrifices. They would maintain the infrastructure of civilization on the gods' behalf. This creation account is profoundly different from the benevolent crafting of humanity described in some other religious traditions. The Sumerian tablets make no pretense that humans were created out of love or for fellowship with the divine. We were made as replacement workers, cosmic servants designed to free the gods from manual labor. The divine blood within us gave us intelligence and awareness, but it also bound us to the service of the beings who created us. We inherited both the capacity for thought and the burden of endless toil from our divine parentage. Yet the tablets also hint at something else in this creation story. The god who was sacrificed to make humanity was himself a rebel. Whether it was Kingu who defied the younger gods by serving Tiamat, or We'ila who led the Igigi in their strike, the divine blood mixed into human clay came from an act of defiance. We carry within us the essence of rebellion as much as the mandate to serve. This contradiction would define much of the relationship between humanity and the divine in Mesopotamian thought. With humanity created and put to work, the immediate crisis was resolved. The Igigi were released from their labour and returned to the heavens. The great gods had servants who would maintain creation on their behalf. The cosmic order established by Marduk's victory over Tiamat seemed secure, but the tensions that had sparked the divine conflicts remained unresolved. The fundamental question of how power should be exercised, whether through command or wisdom, through force or cunning, through authority or compassion, continued to divide the pantheon. And nowhere was this division more apparent than in the ongoing relationship between two of the most important gods, Enlil and Enki. Enlil, whose name meant Lord Wind or Lord Air, was the god of storms and the atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth. He was the son of Anu, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess, born from their union to separate his parents and create room for existence between them. The tablets describe how Enlil pushed heaven and earth apart, establishing the fundamental structure of the cosmos. He was powerful, authoritative, and demanding. When Enlil spoke, his word was law. When he decreed a fate, it could not be changed. He ruled from his temple, the Ekur in the city of Nippur, which was considered the center of the world, the meeting point of heaven and earth. Enlil believed in order, hierarchy, and obedience. He expected the lesser gods to follow his commands without question. He expected humanity to serve the gods properly and to maintain the cosmic structure through their labor. When things did not go according to his wishes, Enlil's response was swift and often harsh. The tablets describe him as quick to anger when the natural order was disrupted. He valued quiet, stability, and the proper functioning of the hierarchies that he had established. In many ways, Enlil embodied the conservative force in divine politics, the power that sought to maintain what had been established and to punish deviation from the ordained structure. Enki, meanwhile, represented a very different approach to divine authority. While Enlil ruled from the Akur above, Enki dwelt in the Abzu below, in the realm of fresh waters beneath the earth that he had claimed after slaying Apsu. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and cleverness. Where Enlil commanded, Enki suggested. Where Enlil punished, Enki found solutions. Where Enlil enforced the rules, Enki looked for ways around them when the rules themselves seemed unjust. The relationship between Enlil and Enki was complex. In some traditions, they were brothers, both sons of Anu. In others, Enki was Anu's son and Enlil's uncle or cousin. Regardless of their exact genealogy, they represented two poles of divine power, two different philosophies of how the gods should interact with creation and with humanity. Enlil was sky-oriented, associated with the heights and with top-down authority. Enki was earth-oriented, connected to the depths and to subtle indirect influence. Together, they formed a balance that kept the cosmos functioning, but it was an uneasy balance, always threatening to tip into conflict. One of the most famous stories that illustrates their dynamic is the flood narrative, which appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, including the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The basic outline is consistent across versions. Humanity had been created to serve the gods and relieve them of manual labor, but humans proved to be very successful at multiplying and spreading across the earth. Cities grew, populations expanded, and with that expansion came noise. Humans were loud, chaotic, and disruptive. The tablets describe how the clamour of humanity rose to the heavens and disturbed the sleep of the gods. And which god was most disturbed by this noise? Enlil, of course, the same god who had been bothered by the noise of the younger gods at the beginning of time. Enlil's solution to the human noise problem was characteristically direct. He would eliminate the source of the disturbance. He proposed sending a flood to wipe out humanity entirely, to wash the earth clean and restore the peace and quiet that preceded human existence. The other gods agreed to this plan, perhaps out of their own annoyance with human noise, perhaps out of fear of contradicting Enlil. A great flood would be sent and humanity would be destroyed. But Enki, who had been instrumental in creating humanity in the first place, could not accept this genocide. He saw value in human life despite the noise and chaos. Humans were clever, resourceful, and interesting. They had developed arts and sciences and built remarkable civilizations. To destroy all of that because the gods were annoyed seemed wasteful and unjust to Enki. Yet he could not openly oppose Enlil's decree. To do so would be to challenge the authority of the king of the gods, and that could trigger another divine war. Instead, Enki used the indirect methods that were his specialty. The tablets describe how Enki went to the house of a particularly righteous man, a human named Atrahasis in some versions, Yasudra in others, and Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian telling. Enki could not speak directly to this man because he had sworn an oath not to warn humanity about the coming flood. But Enki was the god of wisdom and cleverness, and he found a way around his oath. He spoke to the wall of the man's house, addressing the reeds and wood rather than the human himself. "Wall," he said, "listen to my words. Reed house, make sure you understand. Flood is coming. The gods have decreed the destruction of humanity. You should build a boat and save yourself and your family and representatives of all living things. Atrahasis, or Zusudra, or Utnapishtim, depending on which version you're reading, heard Enki's warning even though it wasn't technically addressed to him. He understood what needed to be done. He built a great boat according to Enki's specifications, a vessel large enough to hold his family and animals and seeds to preserve life through the coming catastrophe. And when the flood came, when Enlil unleashed the devastating waters upon the earth, this one human and his cargo survived, riding out the storm while the rest of humanity perished. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights in most versions. The waters covered everything, drowning cities and fields and all the people who had been making so much noise. When the flood finally ended and the waters receded, Enlil was initially satisfied. The earth was quiet now. The disturbance had been eliminated. But then he discovered that someone had survived, that Enki had found a way to save a remnant of humanity, despite the decree of destruction. Enlil was furious. He confronted the assembled gods, demanding to know who had betrayed the plan and warned the humans. Enki defended his actions, and other gods spoke up in support of humanity. The tablets record arguments about the justice of wiping out all humans for the crimes of the noisy ones. Why should the innocent perish with the guilty? Why should an entire species be destroyed when alternative solutions might exist? Eventually, even Enlil was persuaded, or at least he relented. Instead of sending another flood to finish the job, he agreed to let humanity continue existing, but with new constraints. Human lifespan would be limited. Population would be controlled through disease, famine, and infertility, so that the noise could never again grow so oppressive. This flood story encapsulates the fundamental tension between Enlil and Enki, between the god who believed in harsh enforcement of divine will and the god who sought ways to preserve and protect, even when it meant bending the rules. It also reveals something important about Mesopotamian theology. The gods were not unified in their purpose. They disagreed, argued, and worked at cross purposes. Some showed mercy while others demanded justice. Some valued order above all, while others prioritized wisdom and preservation. The cosmos was not governed by a single consistent divine will, but by a complex interplay of competing authorities. This divine disunity had profound implications for human existence. Humanity found itself caught between different factions of gods with different agendas. We were created by some gods to serve all gods, but not all gods agreed on how we should be treated or what our fate should be. Some gods, like Enki, showed us favor and taught us skills and protected us from destruction. Other gods, like Enlil, saw us primarily as servants whose noise and chaos needed to be strictly controlled. We existed in the space between these divine perspectives, our fate shaped by which God's will prevailed at any given moment. The tablets also reveal a more complex understanding of the sky gods versus earth gods dynamic than a simple opposition might suggest. While Enlil was associated with the sky and air and Enki with the earth and waters below, both were necessary for the functioning of the cosmos. The sky without the earth would be empty and purposeless. The earth without the sky would have no structure or authority. They needed each other even as they competed for influence. Similarly, Anu remained the nominal supreme deity, the father of the gods and the ultimate source of divine authority. but his role became increasingly passive. He granted authority to Marduk. He blessed the decisions of Enlil and Enki, but he rarely intervened directly in cosmic affairs. This retreat of the supreme deity from active involvement in the world was a common pattern in ancient Near Eastern theology. The highest gods were too great, too remote, too cosmic to concern themselves with day-to-day management of reality. That work fell to the gods of the middle realm, deities like Enlil and Enki, who were powerful enough to shape events but close enough to creation to care about its details. And beneath them were countless lesser gods, the Anunnaki and the Igigi, gods of cities and crafts and natural forces, each with their own spheres of influence and their own relationships with humanity. The war between earth gods and sky gods, then, was not a single battle but an ongoing tension built into the structure of the cosmos itself. It was the tension between authority and wisdom, between command and persuasion, between the forces that demanded obedience and the forces that encouraged clever solutions. It played out in the primordial conflict between Apsu and the younger gods, in Tiamat's war against her children, in the Igigi rebellion against their masters, in Marduk's defeat of chaos and establishment of order, and in the endless chess game between Enlil and Enki over the fate of humanity. The Sumerians understood that power was never simple or unified. Even among the gods, there were factions and rivalries and competing visions of how things should be. The tablets record not just the victories of order over chaos, but also the costs of those victories and the compromises required to maintain stability. They show us gods who were flawed, limited, and sometimes petty, gods who made mistakes and changed their minds and wrestled with the consequences of their decisions. What's remarkable about these texts is their sophistication. These weren't primitive people crafting simplistic myths. These were highly literate, politically savvy individuals living in complex urban civilizations, people who understood hierarchies and bureaucracies and the exercise of power. Their theology reflected that understanding. The conflicts among the gods mirrored the conflicts in human societies, the tension between rulers and ruled, between tradition and innovation, between order and freedom. By projecting these conflicts onto the divine realm, the Sumerians could explore them in cosmic terms, asking fundamental questions about authority, justice, and the proper relationship between different levels of existence. Consider the creation of humanity. In the Sumerian account, we were made to be servants, but the gods sacrificed to create us was a rebel. We carry rebellion in our divine blood even as we're commanded to serve. This isn't a contradiction the texts try to resolve. It's a tension they preserve and explore. Humans are both servants and rebels, bound to divine will but capable of resistance, created for toil but gifted with intelligence that can question that toil. The Mesopotamian understanding of human nature was profoundly realistic. We are not wholly good or wholly evil. We are contradictory beings containing both divine and clay, spirit and matter, the capacity for obedience and the impulse toward defiance. The gods themselves display this same complexity. Enki saved humanity from the flood, but he also created us as replacement workers in the first place. Enlil demanded our destruction, but also established the cosmic order that makes civilized life possible. Marduk defeated primordial chaos, but did so to secure his own supremacy over the other gods. Tiamat was a loving mother who showed mercy until she became a vengeful destroyer. Apsu was a primordial father who couldn't tolerate the noise of his own children. None of these deities are simple heroes or villains. They're complex personalities navigating impossible situations and making choices that have profound consequences. The tablets also give us insight into how the Mesopotamians understood the structure of reality itself. The cosmos was divided into three main realms. At the top was the heaven of Anu, the highest level of existence, the realm of the supreme sky god. This was the most remote region, farthest from the earth, the domain of pure divine authority. Beneath that was the heaven of Enlil, the atmosphere and sky, the space between the high heaven and the earth. This was where most active divine power operated, where storms were generated, where commands were issued, where the gods who interacted with creation dwelt. And beneath that was the earth and the Abzu, the realm of Enki, the domain of material existence and the deep waters beneath it. This three-tiered cosmos reflected both vertical hierarchy and functional specialization. Anu represented ultimate authority but was largely inactive. Enlil represented active power and command, the executive force that made things happen. Enki represented wisdom and the foundation, the deep knowledge that undergirded all existence. Heaven, sky, and earth, each had its own character and its own ruling principle, and the relationships between these realms, sometimes cooperative and sometimes antagonistic, determined the fate of all existence. Human cities in Mesopotamia mirrored this cosmic structure. The ziggurat, the step pyramid temple that dominated Sumerian and Babylonian cities, represented the mountain linking earth to heaven. At its peak stood the shrine of the city's patron god, the point where human and divine realms could meet. The city itself was organized hierarchically, with the temple complex at its center, the palace and administrative buildings around it, and the homes of ordinary people spreading outward in descending order of status. The earthly order was meant to reflect and maintain the cosmic order. The tablets describe elaborate rituals and festivals designed to reenact the primordial events and thereby reaffirm the cosmic structure. During the Babylonian New Year festival, the Enuma Elish was recited, retelling the story of Marduk's victory over Tiamat. Some scholars believe there may have been a ritual reenactment of the battle, with priests or the king himself playing the role of Marduk. By repeating the narrative and perhaps dramatizing it, the Babylonians believed they were helping to maintain the victory of order over chaos, ensuring that the cosmos would continue for another year. This wasn't just a celebration of past events, it was an active participation in the ongoing work of maintaining creation. Similarly, the construction and maintenance of temples was understood as participation in the gods' work. When humans built a temple, they were creating a dwelling place for the divine, providing the gods with a base of operations on earth. When they performed the daily rituals of feeding the statues, dressing them, and caring for them, they were fulfilling their function as servants of the gods. This wasn't metaphorical service. The Mesopotamians believed the gods genuinely required human labor to maintain their presence and power in the material world. The relationship was transactional but also deeply interwoven. Gods needed humans to feed them and maintain their temples. Humans needed gods to maintain cosmic order and provide the conditions for civilized life. The flood story reveals another crucial aspect of this relationship. After the flood, when Enlil agreed to let humanity continue existing, the gods realized they had made a mistake in trying to destroy us entirely. When the flood was at its height, when the waters covered everything and all humanity was drowning, the tablets describe the gods' reaction. They were horrified at what they had done. They cowered like dogs, crouching against the walls of heaven. Ishtar, the great goddess, cried out in anguish, lamenting that she'd spoken in favor of destroying her people. The gods wept with her, mourning the humans they had killed. This passage is extraordinary. The gods who ordered the destruction of humanity regretted their decision when they saw the results. They realized too late that they had lost something valuable, that human worship and service and presence in the world mattered to them. They were diminished by the absence of humanity. This suggests a theology far more nuanced than simple divine tyranny. Yes, the gods created humans to serve them, but that service created a bond. The gods came to depend on humanity not just for manual labor, but for worship, for relationship, for the validation that comes from being acknowledged and honored. No. When Atrahasis or Zusudra emerged from the boat after the flood and offered sacrifice, the tablets tell us the gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered around the offering like flies. They were hungry. They had been without human worship during the flood, and they craved it desperately. Enlil was angry when he discovered that humans had survived, but the other gods defended their survival, pointing out that the gods needed humanity as much as humanity needed the gods. This interdependence complicated the simple hierarchy implied by creation. Yes, humans were servants, but we were also necessary. Our role in the cosmic order was not just to obey, but to maintain the gods' presence and power through our labor and worship. The more you read the Sumerian tablets, the more sophisticated the theology becomes. These weren't people who believed in simple answers. They understood that power was complex, that authority could be questioned, that the relationship between rulers and ruled was negotiated rather than absolute. Their gods reflected this understanding, engaging in politics, forming alliances, betraying trusts, showing mercy and cruelty in turn. The cosmos was not a settled matter but an ongoing process, a dynamic interplay of forces that could shift and change. The war between earth gods and sky gods was ultimately about this dynamic. It was about whether authority came from position or from wisdom, whether power should be exercised through command or through subtle influence, whether the purpose of divine rule was to enforce order or to foster growth and development. Enlil and Enki represented these different philosophies, and their ongoing tension kept the cosmos in balance. If Enlil had complete control, the universe might be perfectly ordered but sterile and stagnant. If Enki had complete control, there might be innovation and growth but also chaos and instability. Together, their competing influences created a world that was both ordered and dynamic, both stable and capable of change. This theological framework influenced how the Mesopotamians understood their own societies. Kings claimed to rule by divine mandate, receiving their authority from the gods. But the tablets made clear that divine authority itself was contested and complex. A king who ruled like Enlil, with harsh commands and swift punishment, might maintain order but could also provoke rebellion. A king who ruled like Enki, with wisdom and clever solutions, might preserve his people but could also be seen as weak or manipulative. The ideal ruler needed to balance these approaches, knowing when to command and when to persuade, when to enforce and when to show mercy. The legacy of these Sumerian tablets extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. When Akkadian speakers conquered Sumer, they adopted the Sumerian gods and myths, translating them and incorporating them into their own tradition. The Babylonians inherited these stories and elaborated on them, elevating Marduk to supreme importance in their version. The Assyrians took the same narratives and placed their own god Ashur in the central role. The myths spread outward from Mesopotamia, influencing Canaanite religion, which in turn influenced early Hebrew theology. Echoes of these Sumerian stories can be found in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the flood narrative and in certain conceptions of God's relationship with humanity. The Greeks encountered Mesopotamian mythology through various channels and incorporated elements into their own cosmology. The story of Ouranos being castrated by his son Kronos may have been influenced by similar Hurrian myths about Anu. The concept of Titans warring against Olympians echoes the conflicts between generations of Mesopotamian gods. The idea of humanity being created from divine substance mixed with earth appears in different forms across multiple ancient cultures, suggesting the widespread influence of these Mesopotamian origin stories. Even in our modern world, separated from ancient Sumer by more than 4,000 years, we continue to grapple with the questions these tablets raised. How should authority be exercised? What is the relationship between power and wisdom? When should rules be enforced and when should exceptions be made? What do those who hold power owe to those they govern? What do those who serve owe to their masters? These aren't just ancient theological questions. They're fundamentally political and ethical questions that every society must answer. The Sumerian tablets don't give us simple answers. Instead, they show us gods wrestling with the same questions, making decisions, suffering consequences, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. They present us with a cosmos that is complex and contested, where multiple perspectives exist, and no single approach can solve all problems. In this respect, they may be more sophisticated than theological systems that claim absolute certainty and single truths. When you hold a Sumerian tablet, when you trace the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 4 millennia ago, you're touching humanity's first attempts to systematically understand divine power and cosmic order. These weren't primitive superstitions. These were carefully crafted narratives that explored profound questions about existence, authority, justice, and the relationship between different levels of being. The war between earth gods and sky gods was never conclusively won by either side, because it wasn't meant to be. It represented an ongoing tension, a permanent dialectic between different principles of power and governance. The tablets survived because they were written on clay, one of the most durable writing materials ever devised. Papyrus rots, parchment crumbles. Stone is too expensive and difficult to inscribe in quantity. But clay tablets, baked hard in ovens or simply sun-dried in the Mesopotamian heat, could last for millennia. They survived the fall of Sumer, the conquest by Akkad, the rise and fall of Babylon, the devastation of the Assyrian collapse, the Persian conquest, the campaigns of Alexander, the rise of Christianity, the Islamic conquests, and the long centuries when no one could read them anymore. They sat buried in the ruins of ancient cities, waiting for modern archaeology to recover them and modern scholarship to decipher them. When scholars finally unlocked cuneiform in the 19th century, they discovered far more than they expected. They thought they would find administrative records and historical chronicles, and they did find those. But they also found literature, poetry, mythology, and theology of surprising depth and sophistication. They found the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving epic poem. They found the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, the Descent of Inanna, the Epic of Anzu, and countless other narratives. They found mathematical texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, and legal codes. They found a civilization that had developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, literature, and complex theology before any other culture on Earth. The Sumerian concept of divine conflict influenced not just religion but political theory. The idea that power could be contested, that authority required justification, that rulers could be challenged if they ruled unjustly. These concepts had their roots in mythologies like the ones we've explored tonight. When the Igigi rebelled against endless toil, when Ea challenged Apsu's plan to murder the younger gods, when Marduk demanded supreme authority as the price for saving the gods from Tiamat, these narratives established precedents for questioning authority and negotiating power relationships. Modern scholars debate how literally the ancient Mesopotamians believed these myths. Did they think Tiamat was an actual being whose body became the sky and earth? Or was this poetic language for describing cosmic principles? The answer is probably complex and varied from person to person and context to context. A priest reciting the Enuma Elish in a ritual setting might have understood it differently than a scribe copying the text, or a farmer hearing it recited at a festival. Ancient people were no less capable of metaphorical thinking than we are. They could hold multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, understanding myths as both literal history and symbolic truth. What's clear is that these stories mattered deeply to the people who preserved them. They copied them generation after generation. They incorporated them into their most important religious festivals. They used them to educate the young and to make sense of the world. The tablets weren't just dusty religious texts locked away in temples. They were living documents that shaped how people understood their place in the cosmos and their relationship to divine power. The war between earth gods and sky gods gave the Mesopotamians a framework for understanding conflict and resolution. Every tension in their society, every dispute between rulers, every question about authority and obedience could be understood in light of these divine conflicts. When a king had to decide between enforcing the law harshly or showing mercy, he could think of Enlil and Enki. When a subject had to decide whether to obey an unjust command or find a clever way around it, there were divine precedents for both choices. The myths didn't dictate specific actions, but they provided a rich vocabulary for thinking about moral and political dilemmas. They also provided explanations for suffering and injustice. Why did floods devastate cities? Because Enlil was disturbed by human noise. Why did some people survive disasters while others perished? Because Enki intervened to save the clever and the righteous. Why was human life short and full of toil? Because the gods needed our labor but didn't want us to become too numerous or powerful. These weren't satisfying answers in a modern sense. They didn't resolve the problem of suffering or explain why innocent people died in disasters. But they located human suffering within a cosmic framework, making it comprehensible if not acceptable. The Sumerian worldview was fundamentally political even in its theology. Gods had interests and agendas. They formed alliances and betrayed them. They competed for power and influence. They made mistakes and regretted them. This was a far cry from later monotheistic traditions that emphasized divine omniscience and perfection. The Mesopotamian gods were limited, flawed, and capable of being wrong. This made them in some ways more relatable than a perfect, all-knowing deity. If the gods themselves struggled with difficult decisions and sometimes made bad choices, then human failure was understandable and even expected. The tablets also reveal a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between divine and human realms. The gods weren't simply separate from humanity. They were intimately involved in human affairs, dwelling in temples, receiving offerings, responding to prayers and curses. But they were also distant, operating on scales of time and power that humans could barely comprehend. A god's decision could destroy a civilization. A god's favor could ensure prosperity for generations. Humans existed in this middle space, important enough to matter to the gods but weak enough to be easily destroyed by them. This created a careful balance in human behavior. One needed to serve the gods properly, maintaining the temples and performing the rituals, but one also needed to be clever, to understand that divine will was not always clear or consistent, that different gods wanted different things, that navigating the divine realm required wisdom and political skill as much as piety. The relationship between humans and gods was not simply master and servant, but something more complex, more negotiated, more dependent on understanding the personalities and preferences of specific deities. As we near the end of our exploration tonight, it's worth reflecting on what these ancient tablets teach us about the human nature and society. The Sumerians, writing 4,000 years ago, understood that power was never simple or uncontested. They understood that authority required both force and wisdom to be effective. They understood that those who labor for others will eventually rebel if treated too harshly. They understood that even the most powerful beings need the cooperation of those they govern. They understood that different perspectives on governance could coexist in tension rather than requiring complete resolution. These insights didn't die with ancient Mesopotamia. They echo through all subsequent political philosophy, from Greek democracy to modern constitutional governments. The idea that power should be divided, that different branches of authority should check and balance each other, that those who govern should be accountable to those they govern. All of these concepts have their ancient roots in mythologies like the ones preserved on Sumerian tablets. The war between earth gods and sky gods was never just a story about deities. It was always also a story about power, authority, and the proper ordering of society. Tonight we've journeyed from the primordial chaos of Apsu and Tiamat through the birth of gods, the murder of the Ancient Ones, the rebellion of the Agigi, the war with Tiamat, the creation of humanity, and the ongoing tension between Enlil and Enki. We've seen how the Mesopotamians understood the cosmos as a space of competing forces and negotiated power, how they located themselves within divine politics, and how their theology reflected and shaped their social reality. These clay tablets, pressed with wedge marks by scribes dead for millennia, continue to speak to us about fundamental questions of existence and governance. The war between earth gods and sky gods isn't over. It's not a historical event that happened and concluded. It's an ongoing tension built into the structure of reality as the Mesopotamians conceived it, the permanent dialectic between authority and wisdom, between command and persuasion, between order and innovation. Every time we grapple with these tensions in our own lives and societies, we're participating in the same conflicts that the ancient gods embodied. So the next time you encounter questions about how power should be exercised, about when to obey authority and when to challenge it, about the relationship between those who rule and those who serve, remember that humans have been asking these questions for at least 4,000 years. Remember that the Sumerians crafted sophisticated theological narratives to explore them. Remember that the answers were never simple, that the gods themselves disagreed, that wisdom sometimes meant finding clever solutions rather than following orders, and that the cosmos persisted not through the victory of one principle over another, but through the dynamic tension between them. The depth of Sumerian theological thinking becomes even more apparent when we examine the specific texts that have survived. The Enuma Elish, which we've discussed extensively, exists in multiple versions across different time periods. The oldest fragments date to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but the most complete version comes from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE. This means the narrative was copied, preserved, and valued for more than 1,000 years, evolving and being adapted by different cultures while maintaining its core themes. The Atrahasis epic, which focuses on the creation of humanity and the flood, provides additional details that complement the Enuma Elish. It gives us the most complete account of the Igigi rebellion, describing in visceral detail how these lesser gods threw down their tools, burned them, and marched on Enlil's house in the night. The text preserves what might be the world's oldest account of a labour strike, and it treats the grievances of the workers seriously. The gods listen to the Igiji's complaints. They acknowledge that the work has been too hard. They search for a solution rather than simply crushing the rebellion with force. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of labour relations and the dangers of treating workers as disposable. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis is described with remarkable specificity. The text tells us that Enki called for the mother goddess Beletili, later known as Ninhursag or Nintu, to assist him in the creation process. Together they mixed clay with the blood and flesh of the sacrifice god. But they didn't just create humans randomly. They planned carefully how to make these new beings functional and capable of the complex labour required. Bele-Ili pinched off 14 pieces of clay, 7 for males and 7 for females. She formed them with care, giving them the capacity for breath, for thought, for speech. The text emphasizes that humans were designed, crafted with intention and skill, not simply conjured into existence. The Sumerian king list provides yet another perspective on the relationship between divine and human realms. This remarkable document lists the kings of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until the time of its composition. It begins with kings who ruled before the flood, attributing to them reigns of thousands or even tens of thousands of years. 8 kings ruled for a total of 241,200 years before the flood swept over the land. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, but now the reigns of kings were much shorter, measured in years or decades rather than millennia. This text presents kingship itself as a divine gift, something that came from the gods to organize human society, and it locates human history within the broader cosmic narrative of creation, flood, and renewal. The myths of Inanna, the great goddess of love and war, add another dimension to our understanding of divine politics. Inanna was the daughter or granddaughter of Anu, depending on the tradition, and she was both beloved and feared among the gods. She possessed the me, the fundamental decrees or principles that governed civilization, arts, crafts, and social institutions. How she acquired the me is itself a story of cunning and divine politics. She visited her grandfather Enki in his palace in the Abzu and plied him with beer and wine. When Enki was drunk and happy, Inanna asked him to give her the me, and in his intoxicated state he agreed, handing over one after another of these precious powers. When Enki sobered up and realized what he'd done, he sent servants to retrieve the me, but Inanna had already escaped with them, bringing them to her own city of Uruk, and establishing herself as one of the most powerful deities in the pantheon. This story reveals several important aspects of Mesopotamian theology. First, even the wise god Enki, master of magic and knowledge, could be tricked through his own weaknesses. The gods weren't omniscient or invulnerable. They had appetites and desires that could be exploited. Second, power was transferable. The me could be given away or stolen, and once transferred they couldn't easily be reclaimed. This made divine politics a matter of constant vigilance and negotiation. Third, female deities held significant power in this system. Inanna was not a passive goddess waiting to be rescued or wooed. She was active, ambitious, clever, and capable of outmaneuvering even the wisest male gods when she chose to do so. Inanna's descent to the underworld presents yet another aspect of divine conflict. The underworld was ruled by Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister, a dark reflection of the bright goddess of heaven. When Inanna decided to visit the underworld, she had to pass through 7 gates, and at each gate she was forced to remove one piece of her divine power and clothing. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne room, she was stripped of all her glory, naked and powerless. Ereshkigal killed her and hung her corpse on a hook. Only through the intervention of Enki, who created 2 morning creatures to flatter Ereshkigal and ask for Inanna's body, was the goddess of heaven restored to life and allowed to return to the upper world. This myth dramatizes the relationship between different realms of existence and different forms of power. Inanna represented life, love, fertility, and the bright world of the living. Ereshkigal represented death, the dark, the world of the dead. Neither could invade the other's territory with impunity. When Inanna descended to the underworld, she had to submit to its laws, stripping away her power piece by piece until she was as vulnerable as any mortal. The story suggests that even the gods were subject to cosmic laws that transcended individual will. You couldn't simply force your way into another realm. You had to submit to its rules, and those rules could destroy even the mightiest. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though focused on a human hero, reveals much about the gods and their relationship with humanity. Gilgamesh was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a king of Uruk, whose strength and arrogance disturbed both his people and the gods. When his subjects complained to the gods about his behavior, the gods responded by creating Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals, to be Gilgamesh's equal and rival. This decision shows the gods taking human complaints seriously, acting to address injustice even when the perpetrator was partly divine himself. It also shows the characteristic divine solution, not to destroy or punish directly, but to create a counterbalance, someone who could challenge Gilgamesh and perhaps civilize him through friendship and rivalry. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu became legendary, but it ended in tragedy when the gods decided that one of them must die as punishment for killing Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and the bull of heaven, which Ishtar had sent to destroy Gilgamesh. The gods debated which of the 2 friends should perish, and they chose Enkidu. His death devastated Gilgamesh and sent him on a quest for immortality, a journey that would ultimately fail but would teach him profound truths about the human condition and the limits of mortal existence. The epic explores themes of friendship, mortality, the relationship between civilization and wilderness, and the proper attitude toward the gods, all through the lens of a hero who was more than human but still subject to mortal limitations and divine judgment. Gilgamesh's quest brought him eventually to Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, the one human granted immortality by the gods after surviving the flood. Utnapishtim's story, which we've touched on earlier, receives its fullest treatment in the epic. He describes how Ea warned him of the coming flood by speaking to the wall of his house, how he built the boat according to divine specifications, how he loaded it with his family and representatives of all living creatures, how the flood lasted 6 days and 7 nights until even the gods were terrified by the destruction they had unleashed. When the boat finally grounded on a mountain and the waters receded, Utnapishtim sent out birds to test whether the land had appeared, a detail that would later appear in the biblical flood narrative. The gods gathered around Utnapishtim's sacrifice after the flood like flies, drawn by the sweet savour of burning offerings. They had been without human worship during the flood, and they were desperate for it. Enlil was furious when he discovered that Utnapishtim had survived, but the other gods defended the decision to preserve a remnant of humanity. Eventually Enlil blessed Utnapishtim and his wife, granting them immortality and placing them in a distant realm at the edge of the world. But this gift was unique, given only once. When Gilgamesh asked for the same blessing, Utnapishtim explained that it could not be repeated. The gods had made an exception in his case, but immortality would not be granted to humans generally. Death was part of the human condition, built into our nature from the moment of our creation. Gilgamesh's response to this revelation is profoundly human. He mourned, he raged, he searched for alternatives, even finding a plant that could restore youth, only to lose it to a serpent while he bathed in a pool. In the end, he returned to Uruk empty-handed but wiser, accepting that his legacy would be the city he built and ruled, not eternal life. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing the boatman who ferried him across the waters of death the magnificent walls of Uruk, asking him to admire the work of human hands, the city that would endure even after its builder had perished. This was the Mesopotamian answer to mortality. You cannot live forever, but you can create things that outlast you, cities and works that future generations will remember and admire. The relationship between gods and cities was central to Mesopotamian religion and politics. Each major city had its patron deity who dwelt in the main temple and protected the city's interests. Enlil's city was Nippur, which served as a religious center for all of Sumer, even though it was never the political capital. Enki's city was Eridu, considered the oldest city, the place where civilization first began. Anu's city was Uruk, though he shared it with Inanna. Marduk's city was Babylon, which rose to dominance during the Old Babylonian period and elevated its patron god to the head of the pantheon. This connection between city and deity created a form of divine nationalism. When cities went to war, their gods were understood to be fighting through them. Victory in battle demonstrated that your city's god was more powerful than the enemy's god. Defeat suggested that your god had withdrawn support, perhaps because the people had failed in their duties or because they had angered the deity through improper behavior. The political and military fortunes of cities were thus always interpreted in theological terms. Nothing happened by pure chance or human agency alone. Every event reflected the will and power of the gods who stood behind mortal rulers. Kings derived their authority directly from the gods in Mesopotamian political theory. The king was the god's representative on earth, chosen to maintain divine order in the human realm. Royal inscriptions routinely describe how the gods called a particular individual to kingship, how they placed the crown on his head, how they granted him strength and wisdom to rule. This wasn't just propaganda, though it certainly served political purposes. It reflected a genuine belief that legitimate authority came from above, that human power was delegated divine power, and that kings were accountable to the gods for how they exercised it. A king who ruled unjustly, who oppressed his people or neglected the temples, risked divine abandonment and the subsequent collapse of his kingdom. The law codes of Mesopotamia, the most famous being Hammurabi's Code, from around 1750 BCE, were understood as divinely inspired. Hammurabi's stela shows the king receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, who was also the god of justice. The laws themselves cover everything from property rights to marriage and divorce, from commercial transactions to criminal penalties. They establish a sophisticated legal system with different penalties for different social classes, reflecting the hierarchical structure of Mesopotamian society. The prologue to the code explains that Hammurabi received his mandate from Marduk to establish justice in the land, to ensure that the strong would not oppress the weak, to provide protection for widows and orphans. The laws were thus not simply human inventions, but divine decrees channeled through the king as intermediary. This understanding of law as divine in origin gave it tremendous authority, but it also created problems when laws conflicted with perceived justice. If a law seemed unjust but came from the gods, what was a person to do? The myths provided models for this dilemma. Enki repeatedly found ways to work around divine decrees that he considered unjust, using his wit and magic to achieve just outcomes without openly defying divine authority. This suggested that wisdom might sometimes require creative interpretation of laws rather than blind obedience, that the letter of divine command might need to be bent to serve its spirit. The tablets also preserve extensive religious and magical texts, including incantations, prayers, rituals for exorcising demons, formulas for healing diseases, and instructions for reading omens. The Mesopotamians believed the gods communicated through signs, through the patterns of sheep livers examined by diviners, through the movements of stars and planets, through dreams and visions. Interpreting these signs correctly required extensive training and knowledge preserved in schools where scribes learned not just to write, but to understand the complex relationships between signs and meanings, between earthly events and divine intentions. The 7 Sumerian me that Inanna stole from Enki represent the fundamental principles governing civilization. Though the exact list varies in different texts, they typically include things like kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of lovemaking, straightforwardness, the plundering of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood, art, music, and many others. These weren't just abstract concepts, but actual cosmic powers that could be possessed, transferred, lost, or stolen. Whoever held the me that governed kingship had the right to rule. Whoever held the me of music had power over song and instruments. The me were treated as real objects with real effects, suggesting a very concrete understanding of how abstract principles functioned in the world. The demons and monsters of Mesopotamian mythology deserve attention as well. These weren't simply evil spirits, but cosmic forces with specific roles and natures. The 7 Sebetu demons, for instance, were created by Anu and served as warriors. Pazuzu was a demon of the southwest wind, terrifying in appearance but actually protective against other, more malevolent spirits. Lamashtu was a female demon who preyed on pregnant women and infants, one of the most feared beings in the Mesopotamian supernatural world. Protective amulets and incantations against Lamashtu have been found in great numbers, suggesting how seriously people took this threat. The relationship between demons and gods was complex. Demons weren't necessarily opposed to divine order. Many served the gods, carrying out punishments or performing specific functions, but they could also act independently, threatening humans and requiring magical protection and divine intervention. The boundaries between gods, demons, and spirits were fluid in Mesopotamian thought. Some beings could be classified differently in different contexts. Protective spirits could become threatening if angered. Demons could be controlled through proper magic and offerings. The supernatural world was vast and complex, populated by countless beings of varying power and purpose, all interacting with each other and with humanity in intricate ways. Mesopotamian astronomy and its connection to theology provides another fascinating dimension. The gods were associated with celestial bodies. Shamash was the sun, Sin was the moon, and Ishtar was the planet Venus. The movements of these celestial bodies were tracked carefully and interpreted as signs of divine will. The Muldot-Appin texts preserve detailed astronomical observations and the religious significance attached to them. When Venus appeared in certain configurations, it indicated that Ishtar was angry or pleased. When Mars approached particular stars, it suggested coming warfare. The gods quite literally moved through the heavens, and reading their paths correctly allowed priests and kings to anticipate divine intentions and prepare accordingly. This astronomical theology had practical applications beyond simple divination. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated mathematical systems to predict celestial events, creating some of the earliest known mathematical astronomy. They could predict eclipses, calculate planetary positions, and create detailed star catalogues. This scientific work was inseparable from religious belief. Understanding the heavens meant understanding the gods' movements and plans. The universe was not a mechanical system operating by impersonal laws, but a living reality animated by divine personalities whose actions could be observed, predicted, and sometimes influenced through proper ritual and offering. The Gilgamesh epic provides insight into how the Mesopotamians understood heroism and human excellence. Gilgamesh was celebrated not for his piety, but for his strength, courage, wisdom gained through experience, and his achievements as a builder and king. The epic presents him as flawed, even tyrannical in his youth, but capable of growth and transformation through friendship, suffering, and the quest for meaning. This is a profoundly humanistic narrative, valuing human striving and achievement while acknowledging the ultimate futility of escaping death. The hero is not the one who obeys the gods perfectly, but the one who dares greatly, who pushes against the limits of human existence, who builds something lasting even while accepting that he himself must perish. The temple hymns and religious poetry of ancient Mesopotamia are equally revealing. These texts praise the gods in elaborate, beautiful language, describing their powers, their dwelling places, their relationships with each other and with humanity. But they also complain to the gods, accuse them of injustice, demand explanations for suffering. The relationship between worshipper and deity was not one-sided obedience, but a form of dialogue, sometimes angry dialogue. Prayers could include bargaining, threatening to withdraw worship if the god didn't provide protection or relief, praising other gods to make one deity jealous. This suggests a transactional theology where humans and gods needed each other and negotiated their relationship constantly. The wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, including texts like the Councils of Wisdom and the Instructions of Shuruppak, provides practical advice on living well in a world governed by capricious gods and uncertain fate. These texts emphasize the importance of hard work, honesty, respect for authority, care in speech, and proper behavior toward the gods. But they also acknowledge that righteousness doesn't guarantee happiness or success. A good person might still suffer. The gods might reward the wicked and punish the innocent. The world was not just, and wisdom meant accepting this reality while still striving to live well, to build good relationships, to earn respect, and to leave a positive legacy. The complaint psalms, particularly the one known as the Babylonian Theodicy, wrestle explicitly with the problem of divine justice. The text presents a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend, discussing why the gods allow the righteous to suffer while the wicked prosper. The friend offers conventional explanations that divine justice is mysterious but ultimately reliable. The sufferer pushes back, pointing to concrete examples of injustice that suggest the gods either don't care about human Tantukian morality or actively reward wickedness. The text doesn't resolve this tension but leaves it open, acknowledging the profound difficulty of reconciling belief in divine justice with observed reality. This intellectual honesty, this willingness to question and doubt while still maintaining religious practice, suggests a sophisticated theological culture capable of critical thought. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal explores the relationship between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Nergal was originally a sky god, but through a series of events involving insults at a divine banquet and subsequent punishment, he ended up descending to the underworld to face Ereshkigal. Instead of killing him, she fell in love with him, and he became her consort and co-ruler of the realm of the dead. This myth established the principle that the underworld had its own authority structure that even sky gods had to respect. Death was not simply the absence of life, but a realm with its own rules, its own powers, and its own divine governance. The Sumerian myths about Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and his relationship with Inanna add another layer to our understanding of divine nature. Dumuzi became Inanna's consort, but when she returned from the underworld, she was required to provide a substitute to take her place there. She chose Dumuzi, condemning him to spend half the year in the realm of death. His sister Geshtinanna volunteered to share his fate, so each spent 6 months in the underworld, while the other remained in the world of the living. This myth was connected to agricultural cycles, the death and rebirth of vegetation, but it also explored themes of love, betrayal, sacrifice, and the inevitable connection between life and death. The creation myths speak not just to cosmic origins, but to the Mesopotamian understanding of purpose and order. The gods created the world not randomly but with intention. They established cosmic structures deliberately. Heaven and earth were separated to create space for existence. The stars were positioned to mark time and communicate divine will. Rivers were made to flow and provide water for irrigation. Plants and animals were created to serve as food. Humans were made to perform labor and maintain temples. Everything had its place and function within a hierarchical cosmic structure. This worldview emphasized order, purpose, and interconnection. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything served some role within the larger divine plan. Yet this ordered cosmos was always threatened by chaos. Tiamat might have been defeated, but the forces she represented, the salt water of the ocean, the storms, the floods, the diseases, the demonic powers, remained present and dangerous. Order had to be constantly maintained through proper ritual, through following divine laws, through building and maintaining the structures that kept chaos at bay. Civilization was not the natural state of things, but an achievement, something that required constant effort to preserve against the ever-present threat of disorder and destruction. The relationship between Babylon and the older Sumerian cities provides political context for the theological developments. When Babylon rose to prominence under Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, its priests needed to justify their city's supremacy. They did this by elevating Marduk, Babylon's patron god, to the head of the pantheon, creating the Enuma Elish to explain how Marduk earned this position by defeating Tiamat and saving the gods. This was theological justification for political dominance. Babylon was supreme because its god was supreme, and Marduk was supreme because he had accomplished what no other god could, defeating the primordial chaos and creating the ordered cosmos from its remains. The older Sumerian cities didn't necessarily accept this narrative. They had their own traditions, their own patron gods, their own accounts of creation and divine politics. But Babylon's military and political power eventually enforced theological conformity, at least in official contexts. The Enuma Elish became the standard creation account, recited at the Babylonian New Year festival and copied throughout the region. Yet local traditions persisted, and the older Sumerian narratives continued to be preserved alongside the Babylonian versions, creating a rich, multi-layered theological tradition that acknowledged different perspectives and different emphases. The fall of Babylon to the Assyrians, and later the Assyrian adoption of much Babylonian theology, while elevating their own god Ashur, shows how these divine conflicts mapped onto real political and military struggles. The Assyrian versions of the creation myth replaced Marduk with Ashur, suggesting that cosmic authority followed military conquest. Whoever had power on earth had the right to rewrite the heavenly narrative. Yet the underlying structure remained constant. Some god defeated chaos, created order, established justice, and thereby earned the right to rule. The identity of that god might change with political circumstances, but the pattern endured. The Persian conquest of Mesopotamia brought new religious ideas into contact with the old traditions. Zoroastrianism, with its emphasis on cosmic dualism between good and evil, its eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, offered a very different theological framework. Some scholars have suggested that Persian religious ideas influenced later developments in Jewish apocalyptic literature and eventually Christian theology. Meanwhile, Mesopotamian ideas about cosmic conflict, creation from chaos, divine councils, and the relationship between gods and kings spread westward through the Levant and influenced Greek, Roman, and eventually Christian thought in complex ways. The discovery and decipherment of cuneiform texts in the 19th century created tremendous excitement and controversy. The story of how these ancient scripts were finally read deserves its own moment of attention. Scholars had known about cuneiform writing for centuries, but the wedge-shaped marks remained mysterious and unreadable. The breakthrough came through the efforts of multiple researchers working on inscriptions in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian found at sites like Behistun in modern Iran. By comparing different versions of the same text in different ancient languages, scholars gradually cracked the code, unlocking a vast library of texts that had been silent for 2,000 years. When George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, announced in 1872 that he'd found a Babylonian flood story predating the biblical account, it sparked intense debate about the origins and historicity of biblical narratives. Religious authorities and secular scholars engaged in heated arguments about the implications. Were these Mesopotamian myths the source material for biblical stories? Or did both cultures preserve memories of real events described in different theological languages? Did the discovery undermine the uniqueness of biblical revelation, or did it confirm the historical foundations of scriptural narrative? The questions raised by these discoveries continue to be debated by scholars, theologians, and interested readers. The archaeological context of these discoveries adds another layer of fascination. The tablets were found in the ruins of ancient libraries and archives, carefully organized collections that had been preserved when the buildings containing them were destroyed. The Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the mid-19th century, contained thousands of tablets covering literature, science, magic, medicine, omens, and royal correspondence. Ashurbanipal had been a collector of texts, sending scribes throughout his empire to copy important documents and bring them to his library. When Nineveh fell to the Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE, fire destroyed the palace, but the flames baked the clay tablets hard, preserving them for modern archaeology. The tablets from the old Babylonian period scribal schools provide insight into how Mesopotamian education worked. Young scribes learned by copying standard texts, practicing their writing skills while also absorbing the cultural and theological content of the narratives. The tablets show multiple copies of the same texts with varying degrees of accuracy, revealing the learning process. Mistakes were corrected, difficult passages were explained with glosses, and students gradually mastered both the technical skill of writing and the intellectual content of their civilization's literature. This educational system preserved and transmitted Mesopotamian culture across centuries, ensuring that myths composed in the 3rd millennium BCE were still being copied and studied in the 1st millennium. The relationship between oral and written tradition in Mesopotamian culture deserves consideration. While we have these elaborate written texts, they represent only a fraction of the stories, prayers, and traditions that circulated in oral form. Writing was expensive, requiring trained scribes and precious materials. Most religious practice happened without written texts, through oral prayers, traditional rituals, and informal narratives passed from generation to generation. The written texts we have likely represent the official, formalized versions of stories that existed in many variants in popular culture. A farmer in rural Sumer might have heard very different versions of the Enki and Enlil stories than what was preserved in temple libraries. The tablets give us the elite standardized tradition, but they hint at a much richer oral culture now lost to time. The evolution of the god Marduk from a relatively minor deity to the supreme god of Babylon illustrates how political power shaped theological narrative. In the earliest Sumerian texts, Marduk barely appears. He's mentioned as a son of Enki but doesn't play a major role. As Babylon grew in power during the 2nd millennium BCE, its priests elevated Marduk's status correspondingly. They created genealogies linking him to the older gods. They attributed to him victories and accomplishments originally associated with other deities. They composed the Enuma Elish to explain how Marduk earned supreme authority by defeating Tiamat and creating the cosmos. This wasn't simply propaganda. It was a theological argument that Babylon's political dominance reflected cosmic reality. The city ruled because its god had proven himself supreme, and the god was supreme because he had accomplished the greatest divine victory. The 50 names of Marduk listed at the end of the Enuma Elish provide fascinating insight into how the Babylonians understood divine power and identity. Each name represents a different aspect or function of Marduk's nature. He is called Asaluhi the Saviour, Namru the Bright One, Asaru the Bestower of Cultivation, Asaru Alimnuna, the creator of grain and plants, and dozens of other titles, each highlighting a different divine power or responsibility. This proliferation of names suggests that the Babylonians conceived of Marduk as absorbing or embodying the functions of many older deities. By accumulating these names and powers, he became a comprehensive deity capable of managing all aspects of cosmic order. The ritual calendar of ancient Mesopotamia structured time around divine actions and cosmic events. The New Year festival, which we've mentioned, was the most important annual celebration, but each month had its own festivals and holy days. The calendar itself was lunar, with months beginning at the new moon and organized around the cycles of agricultural activity. Planting season, harvest season, the flooding of rivers, the movement of herds between pastures, all were marked by religious observances that acknowledged the god's role in natural processes. This integration of religious and agricultural calendars meant that everyday life was constantly oriented toward divine reality. You couldn't plant crops or move livestock or celebrate a successful harvest without engaging in acts that had theological significance. The architectural design of Mesopotamian temples embodied theological principles. The ziggurat, that massive stepped pyramid that dominated the skyline of every major city, was not simply a platform for a shrine, but a cosmic mountain linking earth and heaven. The gods were believed to descend from their heavenly realms to the shrines at the top of ziggurats, making these structures quite literally meeting places between divine and mortal worlds. The layout of the temple complex around the ziggurat included storage rooms for offerings, kitchens for preparing the gods' meals, bedrooms where divine statues were put to rest at night, and courtyards where festivals and processions occurred. The temple was conceived as the god's house, a place where the deity actually dwelt and needed to be served and maintained. The daily rituals performed in these temples created a rhythm of religious activity that sustained the god's presence. Each morning, priests would wake the divine statue, bathe and dress it, offer it food and drink. Throughout the day there were prayers, sacrifices, and various ceremonies. In the evening the statue would be put to bed. These weren't symbolic acts. The Mesopotamians believed the statues were animated by divine presence, that the gods actually inhabited these carefully crafted images and required the same care and attention a great king would require. This anthropomorphic understanding of divinity made the gods simultaneously more accessible and more demanding. You could relate to a god who needed food and clothing, but you also had to maintain elaborate systems to ensure those needs were met. The economy of the temple was substantial. Large temples owned extensive lands, employed hundreds or thousands of people, and engaged in trade, manufacturing, and banking activities. The Temple of Marduk in Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period was one of the largest landowners and employers in the region. This economic power gave priests tremendous influence in political and social affairs. The separation between religious and secular authority that characterizes modern Western society didn't exist in ancient Mesopotamia. The temple was simultaneously a religious institution, an economic powerhouse, a political force, and a cultural center. Kings had to negotiate with powerful priests, making donations and showing proper respect while also trying to assert royal authority over these wealthy and influential institutions. The process of divination, reading omens to discern divine will, was a highly developed science in Mesopotamia. Omen texts compiled observations about what happened after certain signs appeared, creating databases of correlation between portents and outcomes. If a sheep's liver showed a particular pattern, and a month later the king won a great victory, that correlation was recorded. Over centuries, these compilations became extensive reference works that diviners consulted when interpreting new omens. The underlying assumption was that the gods communicated through signs in nature, and careful observation combined with knowledge of past correlations could reveal divine intentions for the future. This deterministic worldview coexisted somewhat paradoxically with prayers and rituals designed to change divine will. If the omens indicated disaster ahead, you could perform specific rituals to avert the threatened catastrophe. If divination revealed divine anger, you could make offerings and perform purification ceremonies to appease the offended deity. The gods were powerful and their wills were often fixed, but they could also be persuaded, flattered, bribed, or tricked. This left space for human agency even within a worldview that saw divine power as the ultimate cause of all events. You couldn't control the gods, but you could influence them through proper ritual and offering. The magical texts of Mesopotamia reveal another dimension of how humans attempted to navigate a world controlled by supernatural powers. Incantations and rituals provided protection against demons, cured diseases, ensured successful childbirth, attracted love, cursed enemies, and accomplished countless other practical goals. Magic was not separate from religion. It was a form of applied theology, using knowledge of divine names, symbols, and relationships to achieve desired effects. A magician might invoke Ea's authority while performing an incantation, because Ea was the god of magic and wisdom. They might use materials associated with particular gods to tap into those deities' powers. They might create ritual contexts that replicated mythological events to harness the power inherent in those cosmic narratives. The boundary between magic and religion was fluid and context-dependent. A temple priest performing a ritual to purify a sick person was doing something essentially magical, using divine names and symbolic actions to effect a cure. A magician performing the same ritual in a private home was doing the same thing but without institutional authority. What separated legitimate religious ritual from forbidden magic was often more about social power and official sanction than about the methods employed or the powers invoked. The same incantation might be proper piety when spoken by a priest in a temple, and dangerous sorcery when whispered by a lower-class practitioner in the shadows. The myths about Adapa provide yet another perspective on the relationship between gods and humanity. Adapa was a sage, a servant of Ea in the city of Eridu, granted great wisdom by his divine master. When Adapa was fishing and the south wind capsized his boat, he cursed the wind and broke its wing through the power of his words. This act of violence against a cosmic force brought him before Anu for judgment. Ea, knowing that Anu might offer Adapa the food and water of immortality as a reconciliation gift, warned Adapa not to accept anything to eat or drink from the sky god. But when Adapa appeared before Anu, the sky god was so impressed by the sage's wisdom and proper behavior that he offered not the food of death but the food of immortality, the genuine gift of eternal life. Adapa, following Ea's instructions, refused, and thereby humanity lost the chance for immortality that was offered and rejected. This myth explores themes of divine politics, the limits of human knowledge, and the tragedy of missed opportunity. Ea tried to protect his servant, but ended up causing him to refuse the greatest gift possible. Anu intended to reward wisdom, but was thwarted by Adapa's obedience to Ea's misguided advice. The story suggests that even the wise god of wisdom doesn't know everything, that divine guidance can be flawed, and that sometimes the most important moments in cosmic history hinge on misunderstandings and insufficient information. It's a profoundly ironic narrative that refuses simple moral lessons, instead presenting a tragic situation where everyone acts reasonably based on their knowledge, but the outcome is nevertheless disastrous for humanity. The relationship between different versions of creation myths across the ancient Near East provides context for understanding how these narratives functioned. The Enuma Elish shares themes with Canaanite myths about Baal defeating Yam, the sea, and establishing his kingship among the gods. It shares elements with Hittite myths about the storm god defeating the dragon Ilyanka. It foreshadows Greek myths about Zeus defeating the Titans and establishing Olympian rule. These parallels suggest that the conflict between younger generation gods and primordial forces was a widespread mythological pattern, adapted and elaborated differently by various cultures, but expressing some common human concerns about order, chaos, authority, and the establishment of cosmic structure. The persistence of older traditions alongside newer ones in Mesopotamian culture created a layered religious landscape. People might worship Marduk as supreme deity while still honoring local gods who predated Babylon's rise. They might recite the Enuma Elish's version of creation, while also preserving older Sumerian narratives about Anunnaki. This theological diversity was not seen as contradictory, but as reflecting different aspects of divine reality. The gods had multiple names, multiple aspects, multiple stories, and worshippers were expected to navigate this complexity rather than reduce it to a single consistent narrative. The Sumerian myth of Inanna and the Hulupu tree illustrates another aspect of divine activity. The story describes how Inanna tended a sacred tree that was infested by a serpent, a bird, and a demon. She couldn't remove these creatures herself, so she enlisted the help of Gilgamesh, who killed the serpent and drove away the other pests. From the wood of the tree he fashioned objects for Inanna, including the mysterious Puku and Miku whose exact nature remains debated by scholars. This myth connects the goddess to sacred trees, to the hero Gilgamesh, and to themes of cultivation, domestication, and the clearing of wild spaces to create ordered civilization. The agricultural metaphors throughout Mesopotamian mythology reflect the centrality of farming to these cultures' survival and prosperity. The gods themselves were often described in agricultural terms. Dumuzi was a shepherd god, Nidaba was goddess of grain and writing, Nisaba was goddess of vegetation and knowledge. The connection between agricultural abundance and divine favour was direct and immediate in the Mesopotamian worldview. If crops failed, it indicated divine displeasure. If harvests were abundant, the gods were pleased with human service. This created constant pressure to perform rituals correctly, to maintain temples properly, to offer the right sacrifices at the right times. The seasonal cycle was thus also a religious cycle, with festivals marking planting and harvest, rituals ensuring divine blessing on crops, and celebrations of successful yields serving as thanksgiving to the gods who provided abundance. The flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, essential for irrigation agriculture in the Mesopotamian plain, was understood as a divine gift that required proper management through human labour and divine ritual. The construction and maintenance of irrigation canals was both a practical necessity and a sacred duty, repeating the cosmic work of the gods who channeled the primordial waters into ordered streams. The medical texts preserve another aspect of how Mesopotamians understood divine power in everyday life. Diseases were often attributed to demons or angry gods. Cures involved both practical treatments, herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and magical religious rituals designed to expel demons or appease offended deities. A physician might prescribe a particular plant medicine while also recommending specific prayers and offerings. The patient's recovery required both proper medical treatment and proper religious response. This holistic approach to healing didn't separate physical, spiritual, and social aspects of illness, but addressed all simultaneously. The dream interpretation texts reveal yet another channel of divine communication. Dreams were understood as messages from gods or portents of future events. Detailed dream omens explained what various dream elements meant. Dreaming of particular gods indicated their favour or disfavour. Dreaming of specific animals, objects, or actions carried meaning that trained interpreters could decode. The gods could send dreams deliberately to communicate with humans, or dreams might arise naturally as reflections of cosmic patterns and divine intentions. Either way, paying attention to dreams and interpreting them correctly was an important part of maintaining proper relationship with the divine realm. The mythology of the underworld deserves deeper exploration. The Mesopotamian conception of the afterlife was generally pessimistic. The dead descended to a dark realm beneath the earth where they existed as pale shadows, eating dust and clay, deprived of the joys of life. There was no expectation of reward in the afterlife for virtue or punishment for wickedness. Good and bad alike went to the same dreary place. The quality of one's afterlife depended not on moral behaviour but on having proper burial and descendants who would make offerings to sustain the dead. This created strong incentives to have children and to maintain family continuity, since your comfort in death depended on your descendants remembering and honouring you. The judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki in their underworld aspect, were depicted as harsh and inflexible. They decreed the fates of the dead without mercy or compassion. Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, was a fearsome goddess who allowed no escape from her realm. When Inanna descended to the underworld, she could only return by providing a substitute, and even then, the rules of death had to be satisfied. The underworld had its own logic and its own authority that even the gods of heaven had to respect. This realm of death was not evil but necessary, a part of cosmic order that balanced the world of life. The cult of ancestors and the care for the dead played important roles in Mesopotamian religion and society. Families maintained tombs and made regular offerings to their deceased relatives. Failure to provide for the dead could result in angry ghosts returning to trouble the living. The proper treatment of corpses and the maintenance of burial places were social obligations with religious significance. The dead remained part of the family and the community, even after descending to the underworld, and the living had ongoing responsibilities toward them. The transformation of Mesopotamian religion over time, from early Sumerian polytheism through Babylonian supremacy to Persian conquest and Hellenistic influence, shows both continuity and change. Core myths persisted across centuries, but their details and emphases shifted with changing political and cultural circumstances. New gods were added to the pantheon. Old gods' roles were redefined. Foreign influences introduced new ideas that were sometimes integrated into existing frameworks and sometimes remained separate traditions. By the time Alexander's conquest brought Greek culture into direct contact with Mesopotamian traditions, both had already been influenced by centuries of cultural exchange across the ancient Near East. The eventual decline of cuneiform literacy and the rise of alphabetic writing systems contributed to the loss of direct knowledge of these ancient traditions. As Aramaic and later Greek became dominant languages for record-keeping and literature, fewer people learned to read cuneiform. The knowledge preserved in temple libraries became increasingly inaccessible. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the region, pagan temples were closed or destroyed, their libraries scattered or lost. The last known cuneiform text was written in 75 CE, after which the knowledge of how to read these ancient scripts died out completely, not to be recovered until the 19th century. The rediscovery of this lost civilization in modern times has profoundly impacted our understanding of human history and cultural development. The Sumerians were revealed to have invented writing, developed complex urban civilizations, created sophisticated literature and theology, established legal systems and mathematical sciences, and influenced all subsequent Near Eastern cultures. They weren't a primitive people in humanity's childhood, but a complex, literate, intellectually sophisticated society whose achievements laid foundations for much of what would follow in Western and Middle Eastern civilization. The ongoing work of translating and interpreting cuneiform texts continues to reveal new insights. Thousands of tablets remain untranslated in museum collections. New discoveries at archaeological sites add to our knowledge. As scholars develop more sophisticated methods for understanding ancient languages and cultural contexts, familiar texts reveal new meanings. The field of Assyriology, once focused primarily on kings and conquests, now encompasses detailed studies of daily life, economic systems, social structures, gender relations, and countless other aspects of these ancient cultures. The ethical dimensions of Mesopotamian mythology deserve attention as well. These myths weren't simply entertainment or primitive science. They encoded moral and social values, providing models for behavior and warnings about transgression. The gods themselves could be morally ambiguous, but the narratives often explored questions of justice, loyalty, wisdom, courage, and proper social order. Stories about divine conflicts taught lessons about political authority and social hierarchy. Stories about human heroes modeled different forms of excellence and warned against hubris and foolishness. The Mesopotamian conception of Ma'at or Me, the cosmic order or divine principles governing existence, created a framework for thinking about law, justice, and social organization. These weren't arbitrary rules imposed by powerful beings, but fundamental principles woven into the fabric of reality itself. When humans violated Ma'at, they didn't just offend the gods, they disrupted cosmic order, creating chaos that threatened to unravel the structured world and return existence to primordial formlessness. This gave tremendous weight to concepts like justice, truth, and proper behavior. These weren't merely social conventions, but cosmic necessities. The preservation of these ancient narratives through multiple copying, translation, and cultural transmission represents one of humanity's great intellectual achievements. Scribes who carefully copied worn tablets, preserving texts for future generations, priests who recited myths at festivals, keeping alive oral traditions, scholars who compiled and edited mythological texts, creating systematic theologies from diverse sources. All of them contributed to a vast project of cultural preservation that allows us, thousands of years later, to read the words and contemplate the thoughts of people who lived at the dawn of literate civilization. The influence of these Mesopotamian narratives on later religious and philosophical traditions cannot be overstated. The Hebrew Bible, composed centuries after these Sumerian and Babylonian texts, shows clear awareness of Mesopotamian traditions. The Garden of Eden story shares elements with Mesopotamian paradise myths. The flood narrative follows the same basic pattern as Atrahasis and Utnapishtim stories, including the sending of birds to test for dry land. The creation account in Genesis, with its division of waters and establishment of cosmic order, resonates with themes from the Enuma Elish. even while presenting a very different theological vision centered on a single, all-powerful creator god rather than a pantheon of competing deities. The transformation from Mesopotamian polytheism to biblical monotheism represents one of the most significant shifts in religious history. The Hebrew Bible takes concepts and narratives from the older tradition, but reimagines them radically. Multiple gods become a single god. Divine conflicts become cosmic commands. The chaos that must be defeated becomes formless void that yields to divine word. The political struggles among deities become the sovereign will of an omnipotent creator. Yet traces of the older worldview remain even in biblical text. The plural forms in Genesis like, "Let us make humanity in our image," hint at divine councils that echo the Mesopotamian assembly of gods. The conflict with Leviathan and Rahab in prophetic and wisdom literature preserves echoes of the Chaos Kampf, the cosmic battle against primordial sea monsters. The Greek philosophical tradition, developing somewhat later, also shows influence from Near Eastern mythology. The succession myth in Hesiod's Theogony, where Kronos castrates Ouranos and Zeus eventually overcomes Kronos, parallels Mesopotamian and Hurrian narratives of generational conflict among gods. Plato's demiurge creating order from chaos in the Timaeus resonates with themes from creation epics like the Enuma Elish. The Greek concept of Moira, or fate, decreed by powers beyond even Zeus's control, reflects something of the Mesopotamian idea of cosmic decrees that even the gods must obey. The Islamic tradition, developing in a region that included ancient Mesopotamian territories, also absorbed and transformed elements of this older heritage. The jinn of Islamic cosmology share characteristics with Mesopotamian demons and lesser spirits. The throne verse in the Quran describing God's throne over the waters echoes ancient Near Eastern cosmic imagery. The prophet's night journey to the heavens resonates with ancient mythological journeys to divine realms, while Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, radically departed from polytheism. It inherited and reinterpreted symbolic and narrative elements from the complex religious history of the Near East. The modern study of comparative mythology, pioneered by scholars like James Fraser and Mircea Eliade, has revealed patterns that recur across many cultures' mythological traditions. The dying and rising god, the descent to the underworld, the cosmic battle against chaos, the separation of heaven and earth, the flood that destroys and renews the world. All these motifs appear not just in Mesopotamia, but across numerous ancient and traditional cultures. This suggests that certain narrative patterns and symbolic structures resonate deeply with human psychological and social needs, providing frameworks for understanding existence, mortality, order, chaos, and the relationship between human and divine. The Sumerian tablets, as the earliest written examples of these patterns, provide crucial evidence for understanding how these narratives functioned in their original cultural contexts. We can see how myths were integrated into ritual practice, how they legitimated political authority, how they structured social hierarchies, how they explained suffering and injustice, and how they provided meaning and purpose to human existence within a cosmos understood to be governed by powerful supernatural forces. This historical specificity enriches our understanding of mythology as a human phenomenon, showing how particular cultures adapted universal themes to their own circumstances and concerns. The question of historicity, whether these myths preserve memories of actual events, continues to intrigue scholars and laypeople. The flood narrative's ubiquity across ancient Near Eastern cultures has led some to speculate about a real catastrophic flooding event in prehistoric times. Archaeological evidence of local flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE has been cited as possible inspiration for flood myths. But whether the stories originated from historical events or from imagination and theological reflection, their power and persistence derives not from historical accuracy but from their capacity to address fundamental human concerns about chaos, order, destruction, and survival. The apocalyptic literature that developed in later Jewish and Christian traditions shows the lasting influence of Mesopotamian cosmic conflict narratives. The Book of Daniel, written during the Hellenistic period, envisions divine beings warring in the heavens while earthly empires rise and fall. The Book of Revelation depicts cosmic battle between God and the dragon, between heavenly hosts and demonic forces, culminating in the creation of a new heaven and new earth. These Christian texts transform the ancient conflict between order and chaos into eschatological drama, projecting the cosmic war into future final resolution rather than a primordial past. The modern fascination with ancient astronaut theories and alternative interpretations of Sumerian texts deserves brief mention, if only to distinguish serious scholarship from fringe speculation. Claims that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, that Nibiru is a hidden planet, that ancient Sumerians possessed advanced technological knowledge. These ideas distort and misrepresent the textual evidence. Serious Assyriologists working with the tablets in their original languages understand the Anunnaki as mythological deities, Nibiru as a celestial designation for Jupiter or another known planet, and Sumerian civilization as remarkably sophisticated for its time, but entirely within human capabilities. The tablets don't need alien intervention to be fascinating. Their actual content, properly understood, reveals complexity and sophistication that demonstrates the impressive intellectual achievements of early literate humanity. The relevance of these ancient texts to contemporary questions becomes clearer when we consider the political dimensions of mythology. The Sumerian narratives explore power's acquisition, exercise, and limits. They depict authority as negotiated rather than absolute, requiring both force and wisdom, both command and persuasion. They show rulers dependent on those they govern, gods requiring human worship, kings needing priestly support. These political insights from 4,000 years ago remain relevant to modern questions about governance, authority, and the relationship between leaders and citizens. The theological tensions between Enlil and Enki, between enforcement and wisdom, between rigid order and flexible problem-solving, mirror tensions in all organized societies. Do we prioritize rules or relationships? Do we enforce laws strictly or make exceptions for particular cases? Do we value obedience or creativity? Do we maintain order through force or through persuasion? These aren't ancient questions that modernity has resolved. They're perennial dilemmas that every society and every individual faces repeatedly. The Mesopotamian gods personified these competing values, allowing exploration of their tension through narrative rather than abstract philosophy. The creation of humanity as replacement workers in the Mesopotamian tradition raises questions about human purpose and dignity that remain provocative. Are we here to serve greater powers? Do we exist for our own sake or for purposes beyond ourselves? If we were designed for specific functions, does that constrain what we should become? The Sumerian answer was complex. Humans were created to serve but also carried divine blood that made us capable of rebellion. We were workers but also worthy of divine protection, at least from gods like Enki who saw value in humanity beyond our labor. This ambivalence about human nature and purpose resonates with ongoing debates about determinism and free will, about whether human nature is fixed or malleable, about whether we can transcend our origins and design. The flood narrative's environmental dimension has gained new resonance in an age of climate change. The ancient stories describe gods punishing human excess through catastrophic natural disaster. The noise that disturbed Enlil can be read as a metaphor for environmental degradation, for human civilization growing beyond sustainable limits. The flood becomes not divine caprice, but consequence of human overpopulation and overconsumption. The survival of a remnant who heeded warnings and prepared carefully offers a model for responses to environmental crisis. These ancient texts, while not about climate change in a modern sense, provide narrative frameworks for thinking about human impact on the environment and the catastrophic potential of exceeding ecological limits. The tablet's treatment of suffering and injustice, particularly in wisdom literature and complaint psalms, speaks to universal human experience. The Babylonian Theodicee's wrestling with why bad things happen to good people anticipates the Book of Job and remains relevant wherever people question why virtue is punished and wickedness rewarded. the ancient Mesopotamian answer that divine justice is mysterious and that the gods' ways are beyond human comprehension offers both comfort and frustration. It acknowledges the reality of injustice without pretending to explain or justify it, maintaining faith in divine order while admitting that humans cannot fully understand how that order operates. The role of temples as economic, political, and cultural centers in ancient Mesopotamia provides interesting parallels to modern institutions. The temple wasn't just a church, it was also a corporation, a government agency, a school, a bank, a social welfare organization. This integration of religious and secular functions reflected a worldview that didn't separate sacred and profane into distinct spheres. Everything had religious significance, and religious institutions had responsibilities for all aspects of community life. Modern debates about separation of church and state, about religious involvement in politics and economics, reflect ongoing negotiation of boundaries that ancient Mesopotamians didn't recognize. Their model offers both warnings about religious institutions accumulating too much power and suggestions about religion's potential to integrate and give meaning to all aspects of life. The scribal education system that preserved these texts across the centuries provides lessons about cultural transmission and education's purposes. Students learned writing by copying important texts, acquiring technical skill while absorbing cultural content. Education wasn't primarily about critical thinking or innovation, but about preservation and transmission of established knowledge. Yet this conservative approach successfully maintained complex literature, mathematics, astronomy, and theology across vast stretches of time, ensuring that wisdom from earlier generations remained accessible to later ones. Modern education debates between traditional knowledge transmission and progressive innovation echo ancient tensions between preservation and change, between respecting what ancestors established and adapting to new circumstances. The archaeological work of recovering these texts continues, with new discoveries regularly adding to our knowledge. Tablets surface in museum collections that hadn't been properly catalogued. Archaeological sites yield new inscriptions. Advanced imaging techniques reveal text on worn or damaged tablets that couldn't previously be read. Each discovery has potential to confirm, complicate, or contradict existing understanding of Mesopotamian mythology and culture. The field remains dynamic, with debates about interpretation and translation, ensuring that our understanding of these ancient traditions continues to evolve. The ethical responsibility of preserving and interpreting these texts in our time carries weight. These tablets are humanity's heritage, belonging not to Iraq alone, but to all people interested in understanding our species' intellectual and cultural development. Yet they come from a specific place with specific political and cultural contexts. The looting of Iraqi archaeological sites during recent conflicts, the questionable acquisition of tablets by museums and private collectors, the debates about repatriation of cultural property, all raise difficult questions about who owns the past and how it should be stewarded for the future. The digital humanities approaches now being applied to cuneiform texts promise new insights. Databases of translated texts allow keyword searches across the entire corpus, revealing patterns and connections that individual scholars reading tablets one at a time might miss. Statistical analysis can identify authorship styles, track textual evolution, and map the spread of particular myths across time and space. Three-dimensional scanning preserves precise records of tablets' physical characteristics, ensuring that even if originals are lost or damaged, researchers will retain detailed data about their appearance and content. The interdisciplinary nature of modern Mesopotamian studies brings together linguists, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, art historians, and religious studies scholars. Each discipline contributes different methods and perspectives, creating richer understanding than any single approach could achieve. This collaborative model of scholarship mirrors the complex collaborative systems that created and preserved these texts in antiquity, suggesting that understanding complexity requires complex, multifaceted approaches. The personal dimension of engaging with these ancient texts deserves acknowledgement. When you read a Sumerian prayer or myth, You're connecting across 4,000 years with someone who pressed these marks into clay, who believed these stories, who worshipped these gods. That connection across such vast temporal distance is profound and humbling. It reminds us that humans separated by millennia and cultural gulfs still grapple with similar questions, still experience similar emotions, still seek meaning and purpose in existence. The gods they worshipped may seem strange to us, but the human concerns that drove their worship remain remarkably familiar. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive exploration of Sumerian tablets and the divine conflicts they record. We've journeyed from primordial chaos through multiple divine generations, witnessed wars between gods, seen humanity created as replacement workers, explored the ongoing tensions between different divine powers and philosophies, examined how these ancient narratives influenced later religious traditions, and considered their relevance to contemporary questions. These ancient clay tablets, pressed with cuneiform symbols 4,000 years ago, continue to speak to fundamental questions about power, authority, justice, wisdom, and the relationship between rulers and ruled, between gods and mortals, between order and chaos. The war between earth gods and sky gods wasn't a historical event that happened and concluded in the distant past. It's a permanent tension built into existence as the Mesopotamians conceived it, the eternal dialectic between competing principles and values that keeps the cosmos dynamic rather than static. Every time we navigate between authority and wisdom, between following orders and finding creative solutions, between maintaining tradition and adapting to change, we participate in the same conflicts that ancient Sumerian deities embodied. The tablets don't provide simple answers to these dilemmas, because the ancient scribes who composed them understood that these tensions can't be permanently resolved. They can only be balanced, managed, and negotiated in an ongoing process that constitutes the very nature of civilized existence. If you found value in this deep exploration of Mesopotamian mythology and theology, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more investigations of forgotten history and ancient wisdom. Share your thoughts in the comments about which aspects of these ancient narratives resonated most strongly with you, and how you see these eternal questions about power, authority, wisdom, and human nature reflected in our modern world. What lessons from these 4,000-year-old tablets seem most relevant to contemporary challenges? How do the conflicts between different divine approaches to governance mirror conflicts in our own societies and institutions? Until next time, may you navigate skillfully between the wisdom of the earth and the authority of the heavens, remembering that you carry both rebellion and service in your blood, just as the Sumerians understood those 4,000 years ago. Good night.